President. Mr. President, President Biden has opened our homeland to the world's criminals. Under his leadership, over 9 million illegal immigrants have crossed our southern border. 9 million people. That's more people than the population of 75% of our states. Month after month and year after year, the Biden administration is shattering all the wrong records. For example, CBP has reported 1.6 million known gotaways in the last 3 years, a stark increase from the 1.4 million known gotaways we saw in a 10-year span from 2010 to 2020. And that's just the known gotaways. Who really knows how many people have gotten past CBP undetected? And these aren't just plain old numbers, folks, okay? They're people that too often include violent criminals who harm Americans. Hardly a day goes by without hearing of another American who has fallen victim to crimes perpetuated by the illegal immigrants the Biden administration has let flood into our country. We all read the stories of the illegals arrested on serious criminal charges and post bail, never to be heard from again. Everyone knows the story of Laken Riley, the 22-year-old nursing student beaten to death by an illegal immigrant who was in police custody in New York City before being let go. But the crisis only continues. Just last Friday, news broke that Raul Santana, a Mexican national who was in the United States illegally, had his bail dropped from $1 million to $100,000. What did he do? Well, he struck and killed Washington State Trooper Christopher Gadd while driving drunk and high at 112 miles per hour. For more than 8 years, I have warned against the dangers of letting illegal immigrants who have already broken our laws roam the country and continue their lawlessness. I have repeatedly called on this body to step up and protect innocent Americans from criminals who are in our country illegally and pass my bill, Sarah's Law. 8 years ago, Iowans Michelle and Scott Root woke up to every parent's worst nightmare. Their daughter Sarah was killed by a drunk driver. Sarah, a 21-year-old from Council Bluffs, had just graduated from Bellevue University in Nebraska with a 4.0 GPA. She had a bachelor's degree in criminal investigations. She was headed home after celebrating her important life milestone with her friends and her family. She had her entire life ahead of her. But like Trooper Gadd, she was struck and killed by an illegal immigrant drunk driving. Before the Root family could even lay Sarah to rest, her murderer posted a $5,000 bond, was released, disappeared, and has never been seen again. Mr. President, these tragedies don't have to continue happening. Today, we can act to ensure no family will be subject to the pain and anguish Sarah's parents have experienced every day for the past 8 years. My bill, which is named for Sarah, would close the appalling loophole that let Sarah's killer go free. It would merely require ICE to detain otherwise deportable illegal immigrants charged with killing or seriously injuring another person. It also requires ICE to inform victims and family members of necessary information pertaining to the investigation. Had Sarah's law been on the books when Sarah and Laken and Trooper Gadd were murdered, law enforcement would have to detain their killers instead of opening the door for them to simply flee. The Roots, the Rileys, and the Gadds would have been kept up to date on federal immigration authorities' efforts to remove their loved ones' murderers from the country. Simply put, folks, this should be easy. This should be easy. Sarah, Laken, and Trooper Gadd's deaths are tragic and unfortunately doomed to be repeated thanks to the administration's broken and ill-informed policies and my Democrat colleagues' refusal to take up this very simple legislation. Those who come here illegally and harm our citizens should, without question, be a priority for removal. It's just common sense, folks. Otherwise deportable illegal immigrants who commit violent crimes in the U.S. should face justice. We can no longer prioritize illegal immigrants over public safety. We must pass Sarah's law to send this message loud and clear for Sarah's family and for the countless American families that Sarah's law would protect. As if in legislative session, I ask unanimous consent that the Judiciary Committee be discharged from further consideration of S-160 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. Further, that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Mr. President, reserving the right to object, I don't think we are in disagreement on the Senate floor on this matter. I think we all agree that non-citizens who are convicted of serious violent crimes, who have committed serious violent crimes, should be detained, and they should be subject to removal proceedings. The good news is that is the current law. That is the current law. This bill is a reiteration of current law. Let me tell you what current law requires. Current law requires the detention of any individual with serious criminal convictions, including those who have committed crimes of violence or theft offenses, including murder, rape, and assault. That is the current law. Furthermore, this administration has given specific direction to the Department of Justice to prioritize the detention and removal of individuals who have committed violent offenses. And so, as with earlier unanimous consent requests, this unanimous consent request is essentially a reiteration of current law. I have a great deal of respect for my colleague. We work together on a number of important matters, but I find myself asking the question, why are we being asked to simply restate current law when it comes to the detainment or removal of immigrants who have committed violent crimes, who right now are subject to removal for those crimes? And I come to two conclusions. The first is that it's a means of distracting the conversation from the vote that's going to happen in an hour and a half. We went through a painstaking process to negotiate a bipartisan compromise. That process was begun at the request of Senate Republicans. In the room was their appointed negotiator and representatives of their chosen leader of the conference. It couldn't be more official than that. Their appointed negotiator, Senator Langford, the leader of their caucus, Senator McConnell, in the room for 4 months negotiating a bipartisan border security bill. At the end of that process, we achieved a result. We got an agreement with the people that the Senate Republican caucus told us to get an agreement with. And within 24 hours, almost every Senate Republican had sided against that bill. I submit everybody probably had different reasons for it, but it was very clear that up until the point where Donald Trump said, "Don't do anything, I want the border to be a mess," there were plenty of Senate Republicans that were very invested in that process. Included in that bipartisan compromise are important reforms in the way that we try to make sure that anyone with a violent history never enters the United States. Under current law, if you have a criminal history outside of the United States or a previous criminal history inside of the United States, that doesn't become relevant to your asylum claim until you present before an asylum judge. Under the bipartisan bill, that question of whether you have a violent history and whether you should enter the United States happens at the border as part of your credible fear screening. That would be a really important bipartisan reform to make sure that anybody with a violent history never enters the United States. The current law isn't good enough. The bipartisan bill would have made that law better and made this country safer. But Republicans are going to, almost to an individual, vote against that later today. And so what we're left with are these unanimous consent agreements that don't come close to providing the kind of security that the bipartisan border bill does. But it also serves a second purpose. It also has a secondary impact. I wish my Republican colleagues didn't care only about crimes committed by immigrants. I know they care about crimes committed by others, but it seems that there's a disproportionate amount of energy on this floor dedicated to crimes committed by immigrants, which gives the impression to the American public that there is a specific problem related to immigrant communities, that they commit crimes at rates that are higher than natural-born Americans, when in fact the opposite is true. I worry that there is an effort afoot to try to turn us against each other, to make us fear immigrants, when in fact immigrants commit crimes at a rate much lower than natural-born Americans. U.S. citizens are over 2 times more likely to be arrested for violent crimes than immigrants are. Immigrants are 60% less likely to be incarcerated in this country than natural-born Americans are. The mass shooter in Las Vegas wasn't an immigrant. The mass shooter at Pulse nightclub wasn't an immigrant. The mass shooter in Sandy Hook wasn't an immigrant. The mass shooter in Uvalde wasn't an immigrant. The mass shooter in El Paso wasn't an immigrant. The mass shooter in Sutherland Springs wasn't an immigrant. The mass shooter in Lewiston, Maine wasn't an immigrant. The mass shooter in Parkland wasn't an immigrant. And yet, there wasn't a rush to the floor by my Republican colleagues after those mass shootings to try to fix the problem. I grieve for every single victim of crime in this country. And I think we should be all working on ways to better protect our citizens. But I worry that these UC requests are an effort, one, to try to paper over the fact that Republicans are about to vote against a bipartisan border bill that would make this country safer, and B, in facilitation of an effort, whether intentional or unintentional, to try to make us specifically afraid of immigrants, when in fact the truth is that the people that are coming to this country are fleeing economic destitution, trying to save their children's lives, are coming from places in which they were victims of terror and torture and violence, and when they get to the United States are actually less of a threat to our public safety than those that were born in the United States. And for that reason, I would object.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Senator for Iowa.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will just respond briefly to a number of points made by my colleague in opposition to this bill. And one, I just want to say that, no, this bill, I am not trying to detract or distract from the vote that will happen this afternoon. This is an effort I have engaged on for 8 years. I have brought this bill to the floor many times in an effort to see it passed for Sarah, for her family, and for others that are in this similar situation. So I would hope that we would be able to pass it today. I know that I will, again, in the future, be bringing this bill to the floor. As my colleague pointed out, we do appreciate the fact that there is crime all across the United States. And for those that are impacted by that crime, we do wish that they had not had to go through that crime. But the fact of the matter is there is a difference between American citizens that are committing crimes and illegal immigrants who are committing crimes against American citizens. The difference is that many times those illegal immigrants who, in my bill, I am asking ICE to detain so that they can go to their hearings. I'm asking ICE to detain them, not voluntarily detain, not maybe have someone release them early, but they will be detained to face justice. Many times those illegal immigrants are operating under assumed names, under assumed Social Security numbers. We don't know their true identities. Many times they don't have roots in communities. So what has happened, and we know this to be true because it happened in the case of Sarah Root and her killer, is that Edwin Mejia, that's at least one of the names that this gentleman used while he was in the United States, when he was released on bond, he was able to slip into the shadows. And the authorities were not able to trace him. They were not able to find him. Why? Because he was an illegal immigrant, operating many assumed names, operating out of many different communities, with who knows what family or what contacts. When American citizens are committing crimes, oftentimes we can trace them. We know who they are. We know who their family members are. We know where they've worked. It is very different with those that enter the country illegally. We can't trace them. We can't find them. The families, like Sarah Root's family, Michelle Root, Scott Root, they will never see justice for their daughter, because the man that killed her was released and slipped right back into the shadows where he came from. This family in Council Bluffs, Iowa, will never see justice for their daughter. Many of these other families will never see justice for their loved ones because our law does not require ICE to detain and hold those murderers, those killers, until they have been seen by a court of law. That's what my bill does. It requires the detention, not allows ICE to voluntarily keep them. It requires them to keep them. Justice for our families. And I yield the floor.